Hello, this is Cara from Lady Cara Tarot. This is the second part of my Improve Your Storytelling video, and I wanted to start with an addendum to the first part. And that is to say, whether or not you understand it or not, you are already a very good storyteller. And especially for those of you who say, oh no, I'm not. I'm terrible at storytelling. Let me give you an example. Let's say you go to the big box store in the parking lot, somebody rams into you. And then you have an altercation with the person. When you get home, you'll be telling that story to the people near and dear, either to your family or to your friends. You'll be telling that story. You'll be telling it in a particular kind of fashion. You'll either tell it in a linear fashion, or you'll start with the highlights. You won't believe what happened to me. This person almost punched me. And then you'll go back and you'll tell the sequence of events. We all have this as a way of communicating in some form or another. And that is your basic storytelling gift that you already have. So I want to make sure we start there. You already know how to do this in your real life. The problem that we sometimes encounter is then translating it into some other portion of your life, translating those skills into another arena where maybe it doesn't feel quite as personal. It doesn't have the immediacy. And so then we have to take those skills and work them in to the other thing. And that's what this series is about. This series is about taking those skills that we all have to some degree or another. Yes, some people are more highly dramatic, some people are more soft-spoken, but you still have that storytelling skill. You have your own storytelling voice. That's something else we'll get into. And your storytelling style, we'll get into those later. But I just wanted to emphasize you already have the skill, whether or not you think you do. And as I was saying, I really didn't feel that I did for a long time, and I'm still not sure how well I incorporate those skills into my own readings. It's something I think about regularly, and some readings I do, and some readings I don't. And that's kind of the flow of anything that you do on a regular basis will have an ebb and flow day to day. Was it inspired? It's good storytelling? Was it engaging? So all of those elements exist. Now, and before I move on though, today I'm going to do a view down onto the table with cards as I talk about how the structure of your reading. So yes, last time we didn't get into actually using cards at all. Today we're going to use cards, and I might kind of go back and forth. But how the structure of your reading will affect how you tell your story, because that's kind of like having an outline before you write your novel. Is if you know the structure of the story, and I'm not talking about style again yet. I'm talking about just the structure. How the structure of that will affect your reading, and it will affect the way you tell the story of the reading. Before I leave my analogy of the parking lot, though, I do want you to think about something. Actually, if you've had an experience like that, this is another great thing. This is one of your practice things this week. Whatever this, this story, we all know the stories that we often repeat about our lives. Tell that story the way you always tell it to yourself. This is one of your work things. And then, next time you tell it, add some fantasy element to it halfway through. Some really kind of outre thing, like a bird flew out of the sky, even though there were no trees around, and handed you a message. in the middle of this altercation. Or suddenly a dog wandered over and said a few words to you and barked at both of you and moved on. Those are just examples of something you can add right into the middle of the story, then go back to the story as you usually tell it, and think about how that one change, that one fanciful element, changes the whole rest of the story. Now that is a stylistic thing. That's turning a real life story into a fantasy story. So we're getting into genre a little bit, and we'll do more of that later. But that's just one exercise. Take the real life thing and turn it into a fantasy by just adding one fantasy element, and then keep the rest of it really kind of normal, but then try to incorporate how that would have changed that interaction. So now I'm going to, with that, now I'm going to move over to the table and lay out cards, and we're going to talk about how the way you lay out your cards is going to affect your storytelling for that reading. Okay, so I have moved to the table so you can see, you look at the cards as I talk about the rest of this. I forgot to mention, you're hearing that kind of bubbling, gurgling sound you're hearing in the background is the humidifier that's, I kind of move from room to room to help me with my breathing issues. So what I'm going to demonstrate now is that how the format of your cards makes a difference in how you're going to even approach your reading. So I'm going to start easy with just 4 cards down. If you are a face down card person, that's how I began, and it's still kind of my default if I'm not thinking, if I'm not fully present, I will lay cards face down. If you are laying your cards face down, regardless of whether you're doing an open reading or a spread, the only way you can read this is card by card. So then you're reading this card, and then you're adding the details of this card, then adding the details of this card, and then adding the details of this card, and then you can go back and forth as you, it doesn't mean that you're only doing it like this, 1, 1, 1, 1. You can be doing this card, and then these 2 together, and then adding this, and then these 3 together, and then adding this, and putting all 4 together, and then picking, kind of seeing correspondences and whatever. I'm not actually doing the readings now. I'm just talking about the format of your reading. Conversely, if this is the way you started, if you started face up, then you can read the big picture first. And you can do more about, like what I was saying about journalism. You can kind of say, this is the big picture. Now let me give you the details, and then talk about the details in each one. You'll still be doing correspondences. I think that's how most people read, is you're looking for different things. You can still layer in other things, but you start, when you do a reading face up, you start with the big picture because you have the big picture. No matter how large your spread, if you're starting with cards face down, you can only read them as you turn them up, regardless of, what form the reading is in. If it's in this form, you can still only read them. So your story that you're creating will be somewhat determined by the order in which you turn them up. You still may end up with the same story, ultimately. It's kind of like, if both of them were versions of Red Riding Hood, you would still be telling the story of Red Riding Hood, but the way that you get there would be shaped very differently by whether you're starting face up or starting face down. The other thing that we can address then is if you are doing an open reading, you have more of a freedom to link things up and read it as a whole, as opposed to if you're doing, can I fit this all in? 1, 2, 3. Well, let me just do it like that. There. So if you're doing a reading that has a specific thing associated with each position, that format is going to affect you as well. It is, I think, I consider that to be adding another layer, but again, it would be, if you are saying that this is your topic and that this is what's working against you and this is what's working for you and this is your action to take, that's going to put a specific interpretation and limitation on this and this and this and this. It's those positions confine or define, depending on how you're thinking about it. I think as you know, if you watch me, I do both. I do open readings and I do spreads. And I don't particularly have a preference one way or the other. I just think they're different ways of approaching that story. And you do understand that by having a spread, you give up some of your leeway, but you gain a little bit of definition. So again, if it's the Four of Swords, you're needing rest. If this were an open story, this could be a good thing. This could be that you're finally going to be able to be getting the rest that you need as part of an appreciation of something. If, however, this is what's working against you, that defines this as not just needing rest, but that you're tired and you're not getting the rest. And that you can see a lot of things going on out there, but you're too tired. But you're too tired to even appreciate those things out there. That's just one example. I'm not trying to say that this is the only way to read this, but I'm just trying to give the example of particularly face up or face down is going to define your cards. And then whether you use a spread or not is going to define and shape your story. And again, defining something can be very helpful in creating detail. It's some of the things that people don't like about an open reading is that they feel they don't have enough structure. And they don't, especially for a beginning reader, I think open readings can be a little more threatening because you don't have anything to tell you how this fits into the whole or how this fits into the whole. As opposed, that's the way they were, as opposed to if you do have that definition, that gives you a little more structure for your story. It's kind of like having an outline. If you have a spread, you kind of have an outline that this is going to be the story, topic, challenges, things that work for you, and your action. Without a spread, everything blends and flows together much more and may not have that same definition. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is you have a great deal more freedom. That you are no longer simply have to say that this is your action to take. This could be your action to take. If you don't have an assigned position for it, you could look at all of these and say, this is the action you need to take, so that you don't end up here. So those are my two. So you actually might want to experiment with that. You could even do it with a 3-card reading, just to like get your feet wet in terms of do a 3-card reading, pull 3 cards, and look at that reading, turning them over one at a time. Lots of cups today. And so, read through, practice with yourself. What is this story if you do it this way? Try it again, but this time assign positions, assign spread positions and meanings to them, and do that same thing one at a time. And then come back with fresh eyes and do that same reading as an open reading, already laid out. What's going to change if you can see these at the same time that you see this? How are you going to approach that story differently? Again, our focus is the story that we're telling and how we're approaching the story. And then, if you had spread positions, but you turned them up all at once, how would that change? Now, we're talking about probably not a matter of a difference of how the reading comes out, but a difference in the way you get to the end of the story. Same as I was saying about if it were a fairy tale. We know the way the fairy tale goes, but the way you tell that fairy tale can be determined by whether it's face up, whether it's face down, whether you have spread positions, or whether you're doing an open reading. So we have 2 things to end up with practicing today. You want to, as I said before, you want to tell yourself that story that you've always told throughout your life in the way you always do it, and then add a far-fetched, just out of the realm of reality, a total fantasy, one element, and add that halfway through and see how that would affect the way you tell the rest of the story, still as if it just happened, but it had this weirdo thing happening in the middle of it. So that's your first exercise. And the second exercise is to do a 3 or 4 card reading, and do it face down, with spread positions, then do it face down as an open reading, one at a time. Then once the cards are up, come back to it again as an open reading with no set positions, no spread positions, no internal definitions. And then finally, face up. If all 3 were face up and you had spread positions, how would that be different from turning them up one at a time in spread positions? So it gives you a lot to think about in terms of just the way you're approaching your reading and what it is that you see. You could just as easily do it as a 6-card reading. And there are girls back again from the first reading. It becomes, with an open reading, it becomes much more obvious. The difference becomes much more obvious when you have more cards in an open reading, because then you're seeing this big picture, like a 6-card or a 9-card reading. You're seeing a big picture. And as an open reading, you are creating where to look. Your eyes are creating that, or your idea of position, relative positions, is creating that. So, but again, I think it'd be easier to start it with 3 cards, 4 cards, and then move on to try it with 6 cards, try it with 9 cards. Try it all 4 ways, turning them up one at a time, I'll give you one example um, of, let me find a smaller deck here. So I have a 9-card reading that I regularly do that goes like this. And you read it this way. You could also read it this way. So if you are turning it up like that to get to the end, that gives you a little more definition of your reading. It gives you, it's not the same, it's not as limited as giving each card a spread position that has a meaning, but it does give you an order to tell your story in. Although the reading that I often do that way then says that you need to layer back this way and this way. So then you're adding those layers in, and we'll talk about layers more later, as opposed to if you read this as past, present, future, or past, present, future, they would change. And I think you can see that. And that's where I'm saying that. And then if you turn them all up to begin with, you would see this whole picture first, which would be different from seeing one piece of it unveiled at a time, ending up here. To see the whole thing at once, one of the things that you would see is where the majors are and where the majors aren't. And that would, you also, the other thing that's good for looking at the whole picture is looking at color. You know, we have red here, we have yellow splashed throughout, we have blues there, we have greens here. So all of this is just another way of, this is showing in a larger format how turning them up one at a time defines the story in a different format than the story that you would tell as if you had all of these turned up at once and you see the major things that are going on. So those are a lot of things to think about and work on this week. One of the things I like to do as I go through my daily reading, I may actually read through it, and I've demonstrated this in some of my daily readings. I will read through them a couple different ways. A really good example is the VR that I just did to Teresa about cards and creativity, is that I did the whole reading, and I think I turned them up one at a time, doing her VR response, answering each question one at a time. But then as I was putting it away, I realized I was getting a completely different reading on a different topic. And that was just something I realized as I was putting it away, and I decided to include that because it was only related in terms of my cards and the creativity between us. But at the same time, that was very interesting. It was obvious to me that I was getting a completely different reading in addition to what I had laid the cards out for. And I like to do that a lot when I'm doing my daily readings. It is somewhat of the same practice of does the question matter, which we all know it does. the question that you're using in your mind when you're reading the cards makes a difference in how you interpret those same cards. But it's also an understanding with a daily reading that if you looked at those cards slightly differently, if you laid them out in a spread first, and then you tried reading them as if they had no spread, how would that change that reading? And the same thing is, if you lay them out, turning them over one by one, how would that change if you had had them all up, face up to begin with? Or vice versa, if you started face up, how would that change if you just looked at them one by one? And then what if you changed the order of that, flipping them over one by one? Would that change the reading? So these are all things about how, so again, the point today was, it's a pretty simple point. It's just that the way that you lay out the cards and the way that you turn up the cards has a difference in how you, makes a difference in how you tell that story. And then so you can just, that's just something to, that's the homework for this week, is those two things, those two different ways, the story that your personal story that you already tell, changing it up a little bit, and then with your layout stories, changing them up a little bit and seeing the difference that it makes to you and how you would tell that story. And then if you want to start thinking about it in terms of telling a story, I mean, that's your third point of today, is once you see the difference that comes to you in those different things, then try, how would it, if you were thinking about it as storytelling, how would that change it? And that's where I think the 3 cards or 4 cards would be better for this week. Okay, so I hope that's clear enough, and I hope that gave you some things to think about and some things to work on for episode 2 of Improve Your Storytelling. Thank you.